and welcome to Lecture 2, where we will be studying the Golden Age of Ancient Greece. Here we will see the artworks and architecture that you most likely already associate with ancient Greece. So we're going to begin with the early classical period, from 480 to 450. And this period is really defined by the destruction of Athens by the Persians. They barely won. It was a humbling experience, to say the least, because if we think back to our archaic period, there's this emphasis on this heroic youth, this heroic warrior. And so the Greeks had been taking pride for centuries in their warfare ability. And here, they were nearly destroyed. And they pay homage to that. It was a humbling experience. They left out all forms of destruction for a good 30 years before either burying it or repurposing those materials. So again, there's still this interest in the human body, but now intellect becomes more important because they had been defeated despite their physical strength. So they're looking to new values at this point because of that loss. So physical force is not enough. There's much more of an emphasis on intellect, even more than what we saw with the archaic period. And we'll see that experimentation in art. But they still value these heroic young warriors. That's their ideal figure style, etc. So the Greek early and high classical period is often referred to as Greece's golden age. There's this major interest in the human body and depicting it in a natural and idealized way. This idea of achieving perfection in architecture and sculpture, etc. And there's a great emphasis on intellect. We're applying mathematical proportions to art and sculpture. There's an interest in optics. So artists are really observing the world around them and considering how to develop particular illusions or realism, etc. And of course, there's all forms of philosophy being developed and discussed in ancient Greece. So much so that even under the Roman Empire later, they're still sending their youth here to study philosophy. Now, much of this is developed under the leadership of Pericles. So he essentially almost ruled Athens from 461 to 429 BCE. He was a general during the Greco-Persian Wars. He becomes the leader of Athens, even up until the beginning of the Peloponnesian Wars, where the city-state of Athens is battling with the city-state of Sparta, in which they lose. So we'll see a shift in art later based on that. And so the inscription here says, Pericles, son of Xanthippus, Athenian. And this is a Roman copy made after a Greek original. And he had such a profound, prominent influence on Athenian society that a historian, a contemporary Greek historian of his time, even referred to him as the first citizen of Athens, that he created the Athens and the ancient Greece that we know today. So during the war, the way how they won, essentially, is that the Greek city-states got together and they formed what's called the Delian League. And under this league is they created this almost empire. And Athens came out stronger and had the leadership role of these different city-states. Then after the end of this war, the treasury of the Delian League, in which these city-states have been contributing toward, moves to Athens. And so part of how all of these great projects come about is because Pericles is using this treasury from the Delian League. He promoted arts and literature. Again, it's through his efforts that Athens holds the reputation of being the educational and cultural center of the ancient Greek world. Now let's look at our development in painting with this vase painter. So it's often labeled as an anonymous vase painter, but we mostly associate with the Niobid painter. His name is unknown. He didn't sign this artwork. However, we see this definitive style in which we associate with this artist. So we have two sides of this vase. On one side, actually before I go into that, I want to introduce the concept of humanism. And so this is this philosophy, and we'll see this continue with the ancient Romans, and it's about human potential. We're coming out of a war in which they barely won. So there's this idea of rebuilding, of now reaching our potential. What we did wasn't working, so now we need to try harder and experiment and be more innovative. And we see that in all regards, in all forms of thought and philosophy and study, and we see that in art. And part of that is with our figure styles, where artists are trying to push the boundaries. They're trying to create the illusion of life and space. We already saw this attempt at life and vitality with our archaic smile, trying to create this realism, and that's going to be expanded under our golden age. And so here we see these extremely dynamic figures. Now on this side is a very tragic story. Each side is a different story. But right here, we have the tragic story of our story of Niobid. And her children were killed by Apollo and Artemis, essentially due to her pride. So if you look to the bottom left, we see this deceased person, where she's laying down almost close to our register. There's almost an attempt at a ground line here. And so she has just been killed. She's falling down. We see her almost in this eternal resting position. Where above her is Artemis and Apollo with their arrows. Of course, there's other figures who are a part of this story, but what I want to point out is the different poses that they're standing in or laying in. And so this artist is really showing off his ability to create these different poses. It's extremely dynamic, and this sense of movement is created with the different bending of the knees, and one figure is laying down. We have one female standing upright. We have a male with his legs spread. We see this sense of weight as he shifts forward. And also, line helps us to understand this idea of movement, of weight, because the different lines of the body are bending, etc. We don't just see these very rectilinear, stiff lines. Instead, we see diagonal lines, we see bent lines, etc. And so there's this sense of dynamic movement. Now, if you'll notice, the figures almost seem haphazardly placed, but the argument is that this was based on a mural, because a famous muralist, this wall painter, had recently moved to the same area in which these vases of this style were found. And so the argument is that this artist was looking at these wall paintings in which there would have been a clear landscape with different ground lines and hills, etc. So we don't see ground lines, but there's almost this argument that the different levels that these people are placed on indicates this sense of hills and ground lines based on the murals that he was looking at. So there's this experimentation with space, and he's really showing off his skills of depicting the human form in realistic ways. There's this obvious study and observation where he's observing the figure styles and the positions of the body to create these realistic people with vitality and with weight and gravity. So on the other side, there's some conjecture about this. But essentially, let's take a moment to consider the composition of this side and where our eyes are drawn toward. So, essentially, our eyes are drawn toward the center, and so we have this singular figure who is centrally placed. It's also crowded around him. We have other figures, so our eyes are drawn to this crowded space. We could argue that the use of line also draws our eye to this figure, where if we look at the bottom, this figure on the very bottom ground line against the register, he has this long spear which leads our eyes upward, and again, we're back at this central figure. So this is supposed to be Heracles, and there's some recognizable iconography that let contemporaries know and that we recognize as this being Heracles. So one, he has this club, and it's this thorned club. And that's part of one of the stories of him. He also is wearing this, or holding this lion pelt on the left side of his body. So some of his stories, he had to go through these ordeals, these challenges, these labors. And in the first one, he had to defeat this one lion that was supposed to be indestructible. And that's the first task, and he does defeat this lion, and he therefore wears the pelt afterward. And he's recognizable in art because of this lion pelt. So again, we're still seeing this idea of lions associated with power, and that humans are conquering this power. They're conquering these lions. So themes that we saw in the ancient Near East are still being utilized in ancient Greece. He's also wearing this olive victory wreath atop his head from when he ran essentially the first races at Olympia, which came to create, or were our first Olympics essentially. And around him are these other warriors with shields and with helmets, etc. And so there's some argument that they are speaking to the real Heracles, and there's another argument that this is a statue of Heracles. But either way, they seem to be preparing before battle or resting, but we aren't in the midst of battle. But either way, we're looking at a group of warriors surrounding Heracles. So again, they're interested in the human figure and the idea of perfection, and they're looking at the illusion of space. And so I want to point out some other aspects of space to find, other than our semi-attempt at hills here. So if we look, there's some overlapping figures here. Let's go to the bottom of the scene with our figure who is on our ground line. He's on the register. He's leaning back. But then we have this other figure whose foot protrudes in front of him. So again, there likely would have been, he's sitting on top of this part of a hill. And then your eyes are drawn up to Hercules. And then our eyes are perhaps drawn down the club back to this long spear. And if you'll notice, the lower figure's hands and long spears are in front of Heracles' club. So this overlapping of figures gives us a sense of space. A lot of we see Heracles is in profile, and then other figures, such as this gentleman who's grabbing his thigh and his shin, his face is in a 3/4 perspective, which we really haven't seen. It's not frontal, it's not profile, it's in 3/4. So there's this experimentation going on with depicting realistic figure styles and perspective. And there's also the introduction of foreshortening. And so this is this illusion of projection into space. Look at his right leg. If we were to measure on this two-dimensional space, on this flat surface, his right leg is a little bit shorter than his left leg. This foreshortening gives the visual illusion of him projecting into space. So that's foreshortening, and we'll see that throughout the history of art. Now note, we're experimenting with the body and these dynamic positions, etc., but we're not so much focused on expressions in the face. There's less of an emphasis on emotions, etc. It's more an emphasis on experimenting with the human form. And so here we have our Niobid painter. Now here is the calf bearer, Greek archaic, and we study this with our archaic era. Now I want to point this out, I'm coming back to this because we're actually seeing our early classical work we're about to study in this scene. So on the right side is the photo taken after these figures were removed from the Acropolis, where they were found buried underneath. So after that initial 30 years, where the destruction of Athens was visible everywhere, they either reused materials to create new structures, or in the case of sculptures, they buried them. So all of these valuable, precious sculptures that were atop the Acropolis in Athens were buried out of respect for them. This really helps us in the modern day because when archaeologists uncovered them, they were in such great other than the destructions of Persians, but they're in great condition, so we have a real sense of what this time period was like. And we also know when they were buried, so we can date them a lot better. And so we have our archaic figure here. But I want to point out Critias boy on the right. So here we have him. Now if you'll notice, here he is without a head, here he is with a head. some art historians argue that this head does not belong to this figure because of the proportions. It seems a little bit smaller. But for the most part, we're just going to look at it as a whole and discuss it as a transition piece. So we have some elements from the past, typo, and we see what comes next. And I want to talk about this in terms of contrapposto. So contrapposto is what marks the major change from the archaic to the beginning of the classical period in sculpture. Okay. Before we talk about that, let's compare and see how this is a transition piece. So we have our Critios versus our Ankyvosis. Let's look at our archaic piece where we have these almond-shaped eyes. The face is very rounded. We have these rounded cheeks. We, of course, have our archaic smile. And we are almost at the point of a realistic body. The arms look realistic. We're getting there with the chest and the abs. But there is this sense of realism. And so the Critias boy, let's look at the difference here. The body is idealized again, and it's extremely realistic. Now, remember how I was saying with our last lecture that you can tell the differences between different styles by looking at the mouth, the eyes, and the hair? So look at this shift in hair. Instead of this long hair, what we're seeing is this short hair. The long hair isn't as popular anymore. The eyes are not almond-shaped, they're more naturalistic. And the face is a little bit round, but not as round as our early archaic or most of our archaic in general. The change of hairstyle, it's now cut short, it's combed against the head on top, and then there's these larger curls that make almost a band around his head. The muscles are much more realistic, and if you'll notice, it doesn't look as blocky or stiff. He's not as frontal-faced and standing tall and stiff. There's this sense of weight, and we'll talk about the asymmetry with this, that creates this sense of weight and gravity. But what's still the same is that we're looking at our idealized youth. Warriors at their peak physical condition are the heroes of ancient Greece, and thus the focal point of sculptural art. So let's talk about contrapposto. And again, this marks the shift from the archaic to the classical period. This is extremely realistic. If you are standing for a period of time, even a short period, you naturally go into contrapposto pose. And our artists have observed this. So your weight shifts into your engaged leg, okay, which is his left leg. And then your free leg becomes a little relaxed and bent, which you'll notice then your hips become asymmetrical. One starts to move upward, the other one comes down. And your shoulders do the same thing. So we are not in a symmetrical pose any longer. It's asymmetrical, yet it looks balanced. And so this natural stance, the shift in weight and gravity, creates this extremely realistic figure style. And it defines much of art. We see the contrapposto pose throughout the rest of the history of art. Now I updated your handout and I added this, so if you don't get it in time, that's fine. I added it onto it. But here's our Artemisian Zeus or Poseidon. And I point this out because nowadays we associate ancient Greece with these marble sculptures, but really they had more bronze sculptures than marble. But these bronze sculptures were later melted down, especially during the medieval era. And so they no longer last. The few that we do have are usually from shipwrecks, actually, such as this one. And so here's our Artemisian Zeus or Poseidon. There's an argument about whether it was Zeus holding a firebolt or Poseidon holding a trident. But either way, here's our example of our bronze sculpture. So this medium of bronze, think back to even the ancient Near East, this medium enabled these artists to really experiment, to create these details. Look at the comparison between the smooth marble versus the highly detailed beard and hair of our bronze. And they're able to create different, more dynamic poses because these bronze sculptures are hollowed out, so they're lighter. So you can have your arms extended. Marble is too heavy, so those limbs would break. So it's the bronze medium that enables these artists to experiment with the human body. And look at how extremely realistic and idealized this figure is. Now, of course, he's not our youthful warrior. He does have a beard, and so most argue that this is either Poseidon or Zeus. And let's head to our High Classical period. So, Age of Pericles, he's still our leader of Athens in our High Classical period. And during this period, we have the Peloponnesian War, and this is the city-state of Sparta versus Athens. And we'll see a shift occur after that. But let's talk about our Polykleitos. So Polykleitos, you likely have seen this before. If not, you will recognize it, because here we have our change into our classical art. Now, we have our contrapposto with our engaged leg, our free leg, and look how idealized this body is. Polykleitos has been studying the muscular system of the human body. He knows it extremely well. It's idealized, yet it's extremely realistic. He also develops a canon of proportions. They're thinking in terms of this mathematical ratio. There's this experimentation in every form of study. And so he argued that the ideal, the perfect proportions, because remember, we're in our age of humanism, where you're trying to reach human potential. So this perfection of the human body is where the head is 1/7 the length of the body. And so he sets the standard during this era for the proportions of sculptures. Now, this is a Roman copy. It's marble. I have the word strut highlighted here because you'll notice this weird type of tree branch, arguably, or whatnot, but this base behind him holds up his waist, or his weight, because otherwise this marble is heavy and would have toppled over. But the strut is in between his arm and his thigh, because that arm would have, again, not been able to hold itself upright with such space. Now notice how he's always, since we're over here by this strut, notice how he also, he's even looking at the veins of the arm after a workout where the veins are protruding, etc. So he is showing this idealized figure style. And look at the hair where we see this change. We likely associate this type of hairstyle with ancient Greece because here it is defined by Polykleitos. And he wrote about this, he set the standard, and this is the canon of figure style during our High Classical period. So here we are from our early Archaic up to our High Classical. And the realism, and of course idealized youth that we see. So let's talk about the Acropolis in Athens. So it is this hill visible everywhere in Athens. Now its current state is because of, in 1687, there was the Ottoman Turks were in control of Athens, and basically they were in war. There was some warfare going on, and they stored their ammunitions inside the Acropolis, sure that the other side wouldn't attempt to destroy the Acropolis. Something happened, and it ended up that all these ammunitions blew up. And so the current state of the Acropolis, despite modern reconstructions, is actually due to 1687, so our 17th century. But let's talk about the building projects under Pericles. So remember, he's using these funds that these different city-states had put money toward under the Delian League to defeat the Persians. In fact, he moves that treasury and stores it in the Parthenon. So think of how, with the ancient Near East, we saw this with our temple on our ziggurat, how the excess granary, etc., was stored within this religious structure as a sense of power and control, that they were in control of the excess. So we're seeing that here with the Parthenon. Yes, it's a religious structure. This whole site on the Acropolis is religious, but it's also political. It's a power move. You see it from everywhere, and you're reminded of this new glory of Athens. So there is, like I said, the Delion League. He's using funds from there, so there is some controversy. But either way, this is why Athens becomes the strongest city-state and why we think of Athens over any other city-states when we think of ancient Greece. And so the Greeks they technically came out victorious, and so they're going to start to show this sense of pride in this victory and really emphasize their own cultural superiority. So here we're going to start with our Parthenon, which is dedicated to Athena Parthenos, which is in her virgin goddess form. There's the Delion League if you need spelling. And again, it's being worked on. It's even currently, etc. So it's being reconstructed. You cannot go inside of it, but you can walk around it. My mom went in the 70s, and there's a photo of her inside of it when you could still go in, which is just wild to me. But what we're seeing here is this incredible interest in study of rationality and mathematics. So there are many aspects of multiple, of illusions that we're going to see to create this balanced structure. There's the golden rule of architecture, which is a really mathematical, precise way of spacing out designing architecture. But what they're also doing is, look at this equation, our 2 times y plus 1. So what I mean by that is on the east and west side, the front, you have your 8 columns, and then times 2 plus 1. On either side, you have 17 columns. And so these precise proportions and formulas have been used in the creation of this to create this balance of proportions, this visual unity. So let's consider the exterior in this experimentation and how they created this. So first, on the facade, the columns are actually tilted a little bit because this plays with this illusion of how we view the world and how we view these structures, and it makes it look balanced and it makes it look like it is upright to us. But in order to do that, they had to manipulate the tilt of it slightly. There's also the stylobate, which is our base floor, and it is curved upward toward the center because this gives the illusion from when you're looking at it that it's flat. If it was built actually flat, it would have looked heavier in different areas. So to create this sense of balance, they curved the center upward. So what they also did is as these sculptures move outward and we come to our corner, or not sculptures, sorry, as these columns move outward, they become larger. So our corner columns, as you can see, are larger, wider than our other columns. Now when we see that up close, and you probably wouldn't notice it until I pointed it out, but this creates this sense of balance. A swollen column appears more robust and stronger. It also becomes wider as you go down. So the top is thinner, the bottom becomes wider. If it was all the exact same size in diameter, it would have looked weaker, essentially. Is that these robust columns, and as they get wider toward their base, they look stronger, essentially, in which you probably wouldn't have noticed unless it was pointed out. So here we have our structure, our difference in the columns again. So from a distance, you can't tell any of those proportional differences. It makes it look balanced and powerful. So let's talk about some of the different aspects of our exterior of our plan. So we discussed the stylobate, that's our base. We've talked about columns before, think back to ancient Egypt and this fluting. Remember, that fluted column came from ancient Egypt and actually references the reeds from the Nile River. The top of this column is called a capital. And then above that is our entablature. And so this area is where we see our architrave, which is blank. It would have initially had, you can see the holes. It had not figures, but on top of it, it would have had a different type of material. But above it is our metope and our triglyph. We're going to come back to that, but I want to talk about the plan as well. So these are our temple standards. Is we have the column around it, and then we have the column porch around it. And so you could walk around this, and this is called the ambulatory. And it's almost like a shaded porch, and you could fully walk around the entire structure. Amble means to walk, so here's your walking area. Think of a covered porch. And you would enter into the pronaos, and this is again our porch, our entryway into the actual temple structure. The anta refers to those two wider columns on either side of the entrance. And then you have the cella. The cella is the main part of the temple in which most people could access. We are less restricted than the ancient Near East. And we would have had our cult statue at the far end. So where that rectangle is, instead of the circles, that rectangle would be where our cult statue is. So in this case, Athena. It would have been this giant sculpture of her. And behind that, closed off to the public, only accessible by the priests and these politicians and rulers, is the aditon, where the treasury would have been stored. Offerings, in this case, the treasury of Athens for a little bit at the Delion League. And so here are our three orders of our columns. We have the Doric order, Ionic order, Corinthian order. The Doric order is the beginning. This is what we see at our Parthenon. It's this more simplistic top, the abacus, whereas the Ionic order has this curling scroll type look, and then the Corinthian order has these leaves. It's very detailed. So our classical Greece is more Doric. We lean into the Ionic toward the end, and then it continues in the Hellenistic. There's a little bit of the Corinthian order in the Hellenistic because it's extremely ornate and they like that. But it's mostly utilized, the Corinthian order is mostly utilized by the Romans, so we'll see that in ancient Rome. Now let's talk about the Elgin marbles and focusing on our centaurs versus our lapis at our metopes and our triglyphs. So Lord Elgin, in around 1801, he was the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire controlled Greece. Greece is very broke at the time. And so Lord Elgin takes advantage of this, and he essentially buys at a very cheap price, buys and takes down every sculptural element of the Parthenon. It all resides in the British Museum. What we see here are reconstructions. What we see in the museum right next to this structure, next to the Acropolis, are reconstructions, whereas the originals are in the British Museum. And this is extremely controversial because many argue that they should be returned to ancient Greece, that this was a form of looting and taking advantage of the economic state of ancient Greece at this time. This is the tale of time when one group conquers another, or when one group becomes weaker, their art is taken. So I'm not sure what the answer is. But either way, these are referred to as the Elgin marbles. They are located in the British Museum. And here are just some examples. So this is our metope versus our triglyph. So if we come back to our front, east, and west sides and surrounding the structure. So here are the figure styles. Here's the story and the figures that we're looking at. This is just the story of the centaurs and the lepites. And so basically, both of this creature of the centaur and this lepite people, they descended from the god Apollo. So they're related. And so this is a battle of brothers. But what the Greeks have done is they are depicting these mythological battles to reference this Persian Greco war. In this case, this is a story of where, so there's always theme of combat, but this is the story of these centaurs, which you'll notice have these beards, they're older, they're pretty wild looking, versus the Lapites. And the centaurs were invited to the wedding of the king of the Lapites. But the centaurs couldn't quite hold their liquor, and so they become very drunk and debaucherous. And as the king was just about to wed his queen, a centaur jumped up and attempts to make off with the bride. And of course, the Lapites are not okay with this, and so this major battle erupts. And we see elements of this battle. We see scenes of the centaurs beating them. We see scenes of the Lapites beating them, such as this one on the right, which indicates, he's grabbing his hair, he has his arm behind his back, etc. And so what we're looking at is this reference to the battle between the Persians and the Greeks, played out in this mythological combat, paying homage and respect to it. And it's the wild Persians versus the Greeks, essentially. And so the Lapites come out victorious, just barely. There is a formidable foe. And so this mimics Greco-Persian wars here. So here we are, Medops with the triglyphs. Tri means three, so it's those three lines. And we are going to look above this at the pediment. So what do I mean by that? Here we are at our east and west pediment, so right above the section that we were looking at in this entablature, this triangular area. Our temple of Parthenon is aligned on this east and west axis, and right now we're looking at reconstructions of what likely would have been the original, of course up to assumptions. On our east pediment, we have, and this is the entrance to the temple, and this is the story of the birth of Athena, where she comes out of Zeus's head, fully formed, with her shield, with her helmet, to the shock of the gods around her. So you can see in this reconstruction on the left, the gods lean back in shock because this is unexpected for this fully formed woman to come out. On the west pediment, on the other side, we have the story of Athena versus Poseidon. And so remember how we talked about the ancient Near East, how each of the city-states had a patron deity? Same thing with ancient Greece. And so the story of Athens is that Poseidon and Athena were battling to become the patron deity. And so Poseidon, the god of the sea, he's up on the Acropolis. He takes his trident, and he slams it into this rock, and out comes this water. However, it is salt water. This is not the ideal gift for the Athens or for the people of this new city-state because they can't drink it. Whereas Athena grows this olive tree. So even today, olive oil is associated with ancient Greece and ancient Rome. It's a staple, olives and olive oil. So, of course, you can consume these olives versus you can't really do much with salt water. So the people choose Athena as their patron deity, and this scene depicts that. Here's what exists of it, though, again in the British Museum. So we have our east pediment, the birth of Athena, versus the west pediment, Athena versus Poseidon. Very little remains or is original. Let's look at the east pediment. Here's our Helios, horses, and Dionysus. So this is the birth of Athena. And remember, our gods are reacting in shock. I mean, this fully grown woman just emerged from the head of their great deity, Zeus. And so they're in shock. And so we're looking at these figures, these larger figures on the left, the originals. And as you can see, this goddess is leaning back. She's pointing toward this. She's shocked by this. The figure behind her, the other female, is also shocked with her arm up. Of course, their heads are missing. And right behind them is arguably Dionysus. And he hasn't noticed what's going on yet. His head is still turned. He's relaxing. Then you have those horses there who are reacting to everyone's cries of shock, etc. And look at the figure style. We have these realistic dynamic poses, many different poses. They're weighty figures. There's also this real sense of heavy drapery. We can depict males nude, but we may not depict females nude. However, we get a sense of their body by this heavy, almost wet-looking drapery. So the excuse, this pushing of the boundaries of showing the female body, can be done by this sense of wet drapery that clings to them. It's heavy. So, drapery and weight. Now, Nashville, Tennessee reconstructed the Parthenon, and so here's their reconstruction that we're looking at. Inside, here is an example of our cult statue. So this is the reconstruction in Tennessee. The argument is that it's pretty accurate because we see this figure in coins across, found from ancient Greece. So this is what the cult statue by Phidias would have looked like. And remember, this would have been in the cella as you walked in. This enormous, colossal statue, covered in gold, would have been visible to you as a reminder of whom this temple belongs to. Now let's look at the frieze. So we looked at the exterior, we talked about the columns, we talked about the metopes, the triglyphs, the east and west pediment. And before we enter the actual temple, we go through this other series, remember, around this ambulatory covered porch walkway fully around. And we're going to be looking at this frieze that's pointed out on this screen. So this frieze, at one point there's historians who talk about how they built these scaffolding for people to walk around and view them. The frieze would have been highly colorful. You can bet 9 times out of 10 every structure, every architectural element, every sculptural element would have been brightly colored. And so here they are looking at it, the elite of Athens. But there are some arguments about what is depicted here. It surrounded the entirety of the temple. So some argue that it's depicting the Panhellenic or Panhellenic procession. And so this was this major parade of celebrating this particular Athena Parthenon event, and where the city would be walking through the citizens would be walking through the city of Athens. They'd come up to the Parthenon, up the Acropolis to the Parthenon to celebrate this specific religious holiday. However, the plaque of the Ergostines makes us question this narrative. Some argue that some of these females are actually these young women who were in charge of weaving Athena's peplos, and so that goes along with the story of the Athenic Panhellenic procession. But the new story is that these are the Ergostines, and that they represent the story of the legendary Athenian king Erechtheus, who sacrificed his daughters to save the city of Athens. These aren't the Ergostines. These aren't the peplos weavers. Instead, this is the story of one case in which someone sacrificed themselves for the greater good of Athens. And so think of how this message communicates the specific message to the citizenry of Athens. So this is the frieze. And we will continue with some other architectural structures on the Acropolis with our next lecture before we move into our Hellenistic period, excuse me.